Excuse me, how much does she owe?
$780.
Yeah, that covers it.
Honey, are you sure?
Just don't tell her it was me.
He had $8.43 in his pocket. That was it. That was everything. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. His shoes had a hole in the left sole, and he was walking home from a 12-hour shift at a job that paid him just enough to keep the lights on. Barely. Then he saw her, an old woman, alone at a diner table, crying quietly over a bill she couldn't pay. And this boy, this broke, tired, hungry 17-year-old boy, did something that would change both their lives forever. He paid it. What happened next is the kind of story people say only happens in movies, except this one happened in real life, and it started with $8.43 and a decision that took less than 10 seconds to make. Before we dive deeper into this absolutely shocking story, hit that subscribe button if you believe in holding authority figures accountable when they abuse their power. His name was Elijah Carter, 17 years old, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Macon, Georgia, with his mother, Diane, and his younger sister, Keziah, who was 9. Diane worked nights at a nursing facility. Elijah worked days at a hardware store owned by a man named Greer, who paid him just under minimum wage and called it training pay. Elijah never argued. He needed the money too badly to argue. Every cent Elijah earned went into an envelope on top of the refrigerator. Rent, light bill, Keziah's school supplies, whatever was left, which wasn't much, went to food. On the evening of March 11th, Elijah had just finished a 12-hour shift covering for 2 absent coworkers. Greer thanked him with a clap on the shoulder and sent him home. In his jacket pocket, $8.43, his weekly walking around money. Emergency fund, dinner budget, everything rolled into one crumpled collection of bills and coins. But Elijah was about to spend every cent of it on someone he had never met before, and for a reason most adults wouldn't have the courage to act on. May's Diner on Forsyth Street had been there since 1974. Red vinyl booths, laminated menus, a pie case by the register that always had 2 slices of peach left by evening. Elijah walked past it every night on his way home. He rarely went in and couldn't afford to, but on this night, something made him slow down at the window. Inside, at table 7 near the back, an elderly woman sat alone. She was small, neatly dressed in a blue church coat despite the warmth of the evening, white hair pinned up carefully, hands folded on the table, and she was crying. Not loudly, just quietly, the way old people cry when they've learned not to make a scene, with small, dignified tears that they wipe quickly with the back of a hand. The waitress stood at her table holding a bill. The old woman was opening and closing a small purse over and over, as if the money might appear if she just looked one more time. Elijah watched for 10 seconds, then he pushed open the door. He walked to the counter first, asked the waitress quietly, "How much does she owe?" The waitress, a young woman named Sandra, who'd worked there 3 years, looked at him sideways. $7.80. Why? Elijah reached into his pocket, counted it out on the counter. $7.80, 3 pennies. That covers it, he said, and don't tell her who paid. Sandra stared at him, looked at the money, looked at his hole in his left shoe, looked back at his face. "You sure, honey?" "Yeah," he said simply, and turned to leave. He didn't stay to watch her reaction. He didn't want thanks. He wasn't even sure why he did it. It was just that the sight of that woman in her careful blue coat searching an empty purse was something he couldn't walk away from. He got home that night and ate peanut butter on crackers for dinner. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't write it down anywhere. But someone had seen everything, and that someone was about to change Elijah Carter's entire life. Elijah hadn't noticed him. Almost nobody ever did, which was partly by design. In the corner booth of May's Diner, half hidden behind a copy of the Macon Telegraph, sat a man named Robert Ellison, 71 years old, gray suit, no tie, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked like a retired teacher or maybe a county clerk, unremarkable, comfortable, easy to overlook. But Robert Ellison was the founder and majority owner of Ellison Industrial Holdings, one of the largest private manufacturing conglomerates in the southeastern United States. Forbes had listed his net worth at $1.4 billion 3 years running. He ate at May's every Tuesday, had done so for 15 years, ever since May herself, who had passed in 2019, had served him coffee on a bad night and told him, "Baby, whatever it is, it ain't bigger than God." He'd never forgotten her. He watched the entire exchange at Table 7, and Robert Ellison had not lived 71 years without learning to recognize something rare when he saw it. Robert didn't rush. He finished his coffee, tipped Sandra $40 as he always did, put on his jacket, then he stopped at the counter. "That young man who just left, do you know him?" Sandra looked up. "Elijah? Yeah, he comes past here most nights, works at Greer's Hardware down the road." "Does he come in often?" "Can't afford to," and something in her voice made Robert pause. He nodded slowly, thanked her, walked out into the warm Georgia night. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking in the direction Elijah had walked. In his 71 years, Robert Ellison had written checks to charities, funded scholarships, and sat on the boards of 3 hospitals. He was not a man unacquainted with generosity. But what he had witnessed in the last 5 minutes was different. It wasn't organized giving. It wasn't tax deductible. It was a boy with a hole in his shoe handing over his last $8 so an old woman he'd never met wouldn't be embarrassed. Robert went home that night and made one phone call, and that phone call set a chain of events in motion that nobody, least of all Elijah, saw coming. Elijah woke up the next morning at 6 a.m., made Keziah's breakfast, packed her school bag, watched his mother come through the door from her night shift, tired but smiling the way she always smiled for them, the smile that costs a parent and shows nothing. He headed out to Greer's Hardware by 7:30, swept the floor, sorted a delivery of pipe fittings, helped a contractor load lumber. Normal morning. At 11:15, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Is this Elijah Carter?" The voice was calm, professional, a woman. "Yeah."
"My name is Patricia Hendricks. I'm the executive assistant to Mr. Robert Ellison of Ellison Industrial Holdings. Mr. Ellison would like to meet with you today, if possible, at your convenience." Elijah stood in the middle of the hardware store, holding a box of screws. "I think you have the wrong number," he said. "We don't," said Patricia. "He specifically asked for you." Elijah hung up, then stood completely still for almost a full minute, then called back. Elijah told his mother. Diane sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her son carefully. "Baby, are you sure this isn't some kind of scam?" "I looked it up, Mama. Robert Ellison is real. The company is real." Diane turned the name over in her mind. She'd heard it on the news, in the papers, a name that belonged to a world far from Forsyth Street. Why would he want to see you? Elijah shrugged, but in the back of his mind, something clicked. The diner, the old woman, the corner booth he hadn't paid attention to. He borrowed a shirt from his neighbor Marcus, a clean blue button-down, one size too big, his best pair of jeans, shoes polished as best they could be, hole and all. Patricia had given him an address downtown, a modest office building, not a tower, which surprised him. He'd expected glass and marble. The receptionist smiled warmly when he gave his name. "He's been expecting you." Elijah walked into that office not knowing whether he was walking into an opportunity or a story he wouldn't believe later. Robert Ellison's office had no mahogany desk, no wall of diplomas, just bookshelves, a round table with 4 chairs, and a window overlooking a parking lot. Robert stood when Elijah came in, offered his hand first. "Sit down, son. You want coffee? Water?" "Water's fine." Elijah said carefully, taking the chair across from him. Robert looked at him for a moment, not studying him, more like recognizing something. "You were at May's last night," Robert said. It wasn't a question. Elijah held very still. "Yes, sir." "You paid for a woman's meal with your last money, from what Sandra told me." "It wasn't a big deal," Elijah said quietly. Robert leaned forward slightly. "It was $8 you didn't have to help a woman you didn't know, with no one watching, or so you thought." He paused. "That's not a small thing, Elijah. That's a very rare thing." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Robert said 4 words that made Elijah's hands go still on the table. "I want to help." Simple, direct, no performance in it. Elijah looked at him. "Help how?" "However you need it most. But first, tell me about yourself, honestly, not what you think I want to hear." So Elijah talked, slowly at first, then more steadily, about his mother's night shifts, about Kezia and her school, about Greer's hardware and the below minimum wage he'd never questioned because he needed the job, about the envelope on the refrigerator, about the peanut butter and crackers, about the scholarship applications he filled out every weekend on the library computer because their apartment had no internet. Robert listened without interrupting, without the polite nodding people do when they're waiting for you to finish. He actually listened. When Elijah was done, Robert was quiet for a moment. "You're applying for college scholarships." "Yes, sir. 3 so far." "What do you want to study?" Elijah paused. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that. "Engineering," he said. "Civil engineering. I want to build things." Robert Ellison smiled slowly, and Elijah didn't yet know why. What Elijah didn't know, what almost nobody outside the company knew, was that Robert Ellison had been quietly searching for the right recipient for a full private scholarship fund he'd established 2 years ago in his late wife's name. Eleanor Ellison had died of cancer at 68. She had grown up poor in rural Alabama. She had worked her way through college on 2 jobs and a determination that Robert said had humbled him every day of their 43 years together. The Eleanor Ellison Foundation Scholarship, full tuition, housing, books, and a monthly living stipend for 4 years for 1 student per year who demonstrated extraordinary character in ordinary circumstances. Robert had a committee, he had applications, he had a process, but he'd been quietly dissatisfied for 2 years. The applications felt performative, polished by counselors, shaped for exactly what a committee wanted to see. What he'd seen in May's diner last night was something no application could manufacture. And the woman at table 7, the one that Elijah paid for, had a connection to all of this that nobody had revealed yet. Her name was Dorothy Sims, 78 years old, retired school teacher. She had taught 4th grade in Macon for 31 years. She was also Eleanor Ellison's older sister. Robert had known Dorothy would be at May's that night. She came irregularly when the loneliness of her apartment got too loud. She'd been struggling financially since a medical bill the previous autumn had wiped out most of her savings. She was proud. She hadn't told Robert, hadn't told anyone. When Robert found out the next morning after calling to check on her, as he did twice a week, Dorothy told him what had happened. The bill she couldn't cover, the young man she never saw clearly. The waitress told her only that someone took care of it. Robert was in May's at the same moment. He'd seen Elijah's face clearly. Dorothy wept on the phone. "Who was he, Robert? I want to thank him." "His name is Elijah," Robert said quietly, "and I've already found him." But the twist in this story wasn't finished. Dorothy Sims had something she wanted to give Elijah herself. Dorothy asked Robert for Elijah's address. Robert hesitated, then gave it, with a note asking her to give him a day's notice first. 3 days after the meeting at the office, a handwritten letter arrived at the Carter apartment. Diane found it in the mailbox, ivory envelope, careful cursive handwriting. She brought it inside and set it on the table without opening it. When Elijah came home, he read it standing in the kitchen. Dorothy wrote about the night at the diner, about the shame of opening an empty purse, about the moment Sandra came back and said the bill was covered and she didn't owe anything, about sitting alone in that booth for 20 minutes afterwards, just crying, not from sadness anymore, but from something she hadn't felt in a while. The sense that the world still had goodness moving quietly through it. She wrote, "You didn't know me, you owed me nothing, and you gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost. I will be grateful until my last day." Elijah sat down slowly, read it twice, handed it to his mother. Diane read it, set it down, put both hands over her face. Neither of them knew that Dorothy's letter was only the beginning of what was coming. 2 weeks after the meeting at the office, Patricia called again. The Eleanor Ellison Foundation Scholarship Committee had reviewed Elijah's academic record, straight A's, 2 teacher commendations, a half-finished engineering project he'd built from YouTube tutorials and scrap parts from Greer's hardware. They had voted unanimously. Full scholarship, Georgia Tech, tuition, housing, books, and a monthly living stipend for 4 years, starting that fall. Elijah was standing in the hardware store again when the call came, same spot, almost exactly as the first call. This time he didn't say they had the wrong number. He said, "Can you hold on 1 second?" He walked to the back of the store, past the pipe fittings, past the lumber rack, and stood in the small dusty alcove near the emergency exit. And he cried, quietly, quickly, the way he'd learned to cry, the way his mother cried, the way Dorothy cried, without making a scene. Then he wiped his face, walked back to the counter, picked up the phone and said, "I'm here, I'm sorry, please say that again." But there was still one more person who needed to be told, and that conversation would be the hardest one of all. Elijah gave 2 weeks' notice at the hardware store the following Monday. Gerald Greer was a man of very few emotions, most of them transactional. He looked at Elijah across the cluttered counter with something between annoyance and very briefly something else. "College," he said flatly. "Georgia Tech, full scholarship." Greer looked at him for a long moment. "Engineering, civil engineering." Another pause. Greer reached under the counter and pulled out an envelope, handed it across. Elijah opened it. Inside was 4 months of back pay, calculated at proper minimum wage, the difference between what Greer had actually paid him and what he should have been paid all along. Elijah looked up. "I wasn't right paying you what I paid you," Greer said, not quite meeting his eyes. "That's what I owe you, legally and otherwise." It wasn't a grand apology, it wasn't emotional, but it was real, and it was honest, and from Gerald Greer, it was everything. Elijah shook his hand, and neither of them said another word about it. The Carter apartment on Forsyth Street had never hosted a party, but the night before Elijah left for Atlanta, the neighbors came anyway. Marcus from next door, the Okafa family from downstairs, Miss Tremblay from across the hall, who was 81 and brought a cake she'd been baking since 4 a.m. Diane cooked everything she had. Kezia wore her best dress and refused to let go of her brother's hand all evening. Robert Ellison sent a card. Dorothy Sims came in person with a small upright blue coat, the same one she'd worn at the diner. She sat.
His professor, Dr. Anita Rowe, who had spent 20 years building infrastructure projects across sub-Saharan Africa, noticed him in the 3rd week. "You asked the right questions," she told him after class one afternoon. "Not the easy ones, the real ones." He told her a little about where he came from. She told him about her own path, daughter of a janitor, full scholarship, 3 degrees, 2 different stories, same road. By the end of his first semester, Elijah had a 3.9 GPA, 2 research project invitations, and a mentor who had decided she was going to make sure the world found out who Elijah Carter was. And Robert Ellison, reading the Foundation's quarterly update from his office in Macon, sat back in his chair and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt Eleanor. Not in a supernatural way, in the way long married people feel each other in the texture of a moment, in the rightness of something landing where it should. Eleanor had always said that the point of money was not to hold it, but to aim it. Money's just energy, she used to say, early in their marriage when they had very little of it. Direct it right and it multiplies, hoard it and it dies. Robert had built $1 billion company. He had directed that energy in many ways over the years. Some of them he was proud of, some of them he'd had to learn from. But sitting in his quiet office with Elijah's first semester report in his hands, a 3.9 GPA, research invitations, a professor's commendation, Robert felt that Eleanor's name was finally resting somewhere it truly belonged. He picked up the phone and called Dorothy. "He's doing it," he said. Dorothy's voice on the line was warm and full. "Of course he is," she said. "You saw who he was before he even knew himself." But neither of them knew what Elijah was quietly building on the side, something that would one day circle back to both of them. In his second year, Elijah started a small organization on campus, informal at first, just a group of first-generation college students meeting weekly in the engineering library. He called it the $8 Club. The name confused people. He explained it simply. $8 was everything I had, and I gave it away, and it came back as this, as all of this. So the club is for people who don't think they have enough to give because you always have something. They peer mentored each other, helped with applications, tuition deadlines, housing, the 100 invisible obstacles that first-generation students hit and don't know how to name. By year 3, the $8 Club had 40 members and a small fundraising page. By year 4, Robert Ellison had quietly matched every dollar they raised. At graduation, Dr. Rowe nominated Elijah for the Dean's Award for Community Leadership. He won. He gave a short speech. He thanked his mother. He thanked Kezia, who was sitting in the front row at 13, already talking about being a doctor. And he thanked a woman named Dorothy, who was there in the audience in her blue coat, crying in the good way. And he said one thing that the entire auditorium carried home with them that afternoon. "I used to think I did something big that night at the diner. I've had a lot of time to think about it since then, and what I realized is that it wasn't big. It was just human. It was just the only thing that felt right. We spend so much time waiting until we have enough money, enough security, enough certainty before we help someone else. But I had $8 and no dinner plans, and a woman was crying. There was nothing to calculate. The truth is, the most important decisions in your life won't feel like decisions. They'll just feel like the only thing you can do. I didn't change Dorothy's life that night. I covered a $7 bill. She changed mine. Robert changed mine. Dr. Rowe changed mine. Every person in this room who helped someone without knowing how the story would end, you changed someone's life. That's how it works. It doesn't go in straight lines. It doesn't always make the news, but it moves. It always moves. Elijah Carter graduated with honors that spring. He joined an infrastructure firm the following autumn, building water systems in underserved communities. He still has Dorothy's letter. It lives in his wallet now, folded small, soft at the creases from years of being carried. He has never stopped carrying it. Because an $8 decision on a March evening in Macon, Georgia, turned out to be the most valuable thing Elijah Carter ever spent. If this story reminded you that kindness is never wasted and that it travels further than you know, subscribe to Rollins Justice, hit the notification bell, share this with someone who needs to believe in people again. We tell the stories the world forgets to celebrate. See you in the next one.